Retired combat horse doesn't recognize its former veteran, but what happens next is spine-chilling. The sky was heavy, pressing down like an unseen force. Thick storm clouds rolled over the hills, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. Thunder growled in the distance, a low, menacing sound that rumbled through the packed dirt of the old ranch. James Harper tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck, his knuckles turning white. The windshield wipers fought against the relentless rain, but the road ahead remained a blurred mess of mud and memories. It had been years since he set foot on this land, years since he had left everything behind, including the one soul who had never left him. Max. The name sat heavy in his chest, a quiet ache that had never faded. As the truck rumbled up the long, winding driveway, the old farmhouse emerged from the storm's haze, its wooden structure worn but standing. The place looked almost the same, yet everything felt different. James killed the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the drumming rain on the roof. His heart pounded. He had faced war, seen men break apart in the chaos of battle, but somehow, stepping onto this ranch after all this time felt harder than any of that. Then he saw him. Max sat near the porch, his golden fur damp from the rain, ears slightly perked yet still. His eyes, once filled with endless love and excitement, now held something else, distance. James swallowed the lump in his throat and slowly opened the door. His boots hit the wet ground with a dull thud. "Max," he murmured. The dog didn't move. James took a step forward, cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. The last time he had seen Max, he was just a puppy, his puppy. They had been inseparable. Long hikes, playful wrestling in the grass, quiet nights under the stars. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been James' shadow, his closest friend. Then James had left, and Max had waited. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Every morning, the dog had sat by the fence, eyes locked on the road, waiting for his owner to return. He barely ate. He barely moved. Until one day, something in him changed. He stopped waiting. Now, as James stood in the rain, watching the dog he had once loved more than anything, he felt a deep, gnawing pain in his chest. "Hey, buddy," he tried again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Max's tail didn't wag. He didn't come running as he once would have. Instead, he stood, ears flicking slightly, and then he turned away. A rejection. James felt the sting of it, sharper than any bullet wound. He exhaled, running a hand through his damp, graying hair. Of course, what had he expected? That he could just walk back into Max's life and things would be the same? "You don't trust me anymore, do you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Max didn't answer. He simply padded away, disappearing into the shadows of the porch. James clenched his jaw, forcing down the tightness in his throat. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had known he had lost something precious. But seeing it, feeling it, was a different kind of pain entirely. Behind him, the rain kept falling, washing over the ranch like it was trying to erase the past. But James knew better. Some things couldn't be washed away. Some things had to be earned back. James didn't sleep that night. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the wind still howled through the trees, rattling the old wooden walls of the cabin he was staying in. The bed beneath him was stiff, unfamiliar, but it wasn't the discomfort that kept him awake. It was the silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of things left unsaid, of memories that wouldn't let go. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Max. Not the distant, cautious dog he had seen today, but the eager, joyful pup from years ago. He saw him bounding through the tall grass, ears flopping, tongue hanging out, always looking back at James as if to say, "Come on, keep up." But now, Max didn't look back at him. James exhaled and sat up, rubbing a hand down his face. His fingers traced over the rough stubble on his jaw, over the lines that had deepened in his absence. He felt old, and maybe he was. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, the air damp and cool against his skin. The ranch stretched before him, the land soaked from the storm. Somewhere in the darkness, Max was out there, watching, or maybe pretending James didn't exist. James walked toward the porch where he had last seen the dog. He stopped at the wooden steps, hands in his pockets, scanning the shadows. "You used to follow me everywhere, you know," he said quietly. His voice felt strange in the stillness. No response. James sighed, lowering himself to sit on the steps. He stared out at the land, at the same hills he had played on as a kid, at the fence where Max used to wait for him. Jenny, the young woman who helped take care of the ranch, had told him earlier that Max had changed. He wouldn't eat properly for months after you left, she had said, hesitant, like she didn't want to place blame but also didn't want to sugarcoat it. He kept waiting by the road. Every single day, rain or shine. He wouldn't move. We tried everything, James. But she had shaken her head. He just stayed there. And James had stayed away. He swallowed hard, guilt pressing against his ribs. Max had waited, and waited. And when James hadn't come back, something inside him had shifted. The dog that had once lived for his best friend had learned to live without him. Now, James wasn't sure how to undo that. A sudden sound broke the quiet. Soft, cautious footsteps. He turned his head slightly and saw a shadow move in the darkness. Near the barn, Max stood watching him, his body still, his golden fur catching the moonlight. James didn't move. Neither did Max. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, a distance neither of them knew how to close. And then, just as quietly as he had appeared, Max turned and walked away. James let out a slow breath, his chest tightening. This wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth saving ever was. The next morning, the ranch was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp earth and a sky streaked with pale gray. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, fresh and raw, but James barely noticed. His mind was stuck on one thing. Max. The dog had been here all along, yet he felt impossibly out of reach. The bond they once had, the one that had been unshakable, was now nothing but a ghost of the past. James stood by the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, scanning the field. He spotted Max near the barn, lying on the damp grass, staring at nothing in particular. He took a slow breath. "All right, buddy, let's try this again." Setting the cup down, James grabbed a familiar object from his truck, a red, battered tennis ball. The same ball Max had once refused to go anywhere without. He walked toward the barn, moving carefully, trying not to seem too eager, too desperate. The last thing he wanted was to scare Max off. The dog lifted his head as James approached, his dark eyes calm but unreadable. James stopped a few feet away and crouched down. "Hey, bud," he said gently. He held up the tennis ball, rolling it in his palm before tossing it a short distance away. "Remember this?" Max didn't move, not even a flicker of recognition. James swallowed hard. He had expected hesitation, but not this, emptiness. "You used to chase this thing like your life depended on it," James continued, his voice quieter now. "You'd drop it in my lap at the worst times. Wouldn't stop until I threw it." Nothing. Max's gaze flickered toward the ball, but he didn't make a move for it. Instead, he slowly got to his feet, stretched, and, with deliberate slowness, turned away. James felt his heart sink. This wasn't just stubbornness. This wasn't a game. Max was hurt. Not physically, but in a way that ran far deeper. He didn't trust James. Not anymore. James exhaled and ran a hand down his face. "Okay," he murmured. "I get it." He reached for the ball and picked it up, brushing the dirt off before slipping it into his jacket pocket. Max had been the one left behind. He had been the one to sit by that fence every day, waiting for someone who never came. And now, James was the one waiting. He stood there for a while, watching as Max wandered toward a shady spot under an old oak tree. The dog stretched out, resting his head on his paws, as if he hadn't just shattered James' heart all over again. Jenny's voice broke through his thoughts. "You really thought it'd be that easy?" James turned to see her leaning against the fence, arms crossed, an amused yet sympathetic look on her face. "Didn't think it'd be this hard," he admitted. Jenny tilted her head toward Max. "He's got a long memory, especially when it comes to people who meant the world to him." James felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He nodded slowly. "I don't blame him." Jenny studied him for a moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. "He'll come around, but not on your terms. On his." James glanced back at Max. The dog had closed his eyes, his breathing slow and steady, as if he had already decided James wasn't worth his energy. He clenched his jaw. "Then I'll wait," he said, because after everything, it was the least he could do. The storm returned that night. James had seen it brewing on the horizon long before the first rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. The wind picked up, shaking the old wooden shutters of the cabin. carrying the scent of rain and electricity through the cracks in the walls. He had always hated storms. Or rather, he had learned to. Before the war, thunder had been nothing more than nature's distant voice, something to be admired, maybe even enjoyed. But now, the deep growl of the sky sent ice through his veins. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was the past clawing its way back into his mind. James sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, fingers tangled in his damp hair. His breath was already coming in shallow bursts. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, tightening like a noose. Outside, the first crack of lightning split the sky. Then came the thunder. Loud. Sudden. Too close. James flinched. His body went rigid, his hands clenching into fists as his mind betrayed him, dragging him backward into a place he had fought to leave behind. Not here. Not now. He squeezed his eyes shut, but it was no use. He was no longer in the cabin. He was in the desert. The air was thick with heat, the scent of burning fuel clogging his lungs. The ground shook beneath him, explosions ripping through the silence, turning night into day for brief, horrifying moments. Someone was screaming. He wasn't sure if it was them or him. Move, damn it. Move. But his body wouldn't listen. He felt himself slipping, drowning in the noise, in the panic, in the chaos. Then, something warm touched his hand. A weight pressed against his leg. James' eyes flew open. Max. The dog was there, right in front of him, ears flattened against his skull, his deep brown eyes locked onto James' face with something between worry and understanding. James blinked, his pulse still erratic, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Max didn't move. He just stayed there, steady, unmoving, real. The next clap of thunder roared through the sky, and James felt his whole body jerk. His hands trembled. But Max didn't flinch. Instead, he pushed his nose against James' palm. A small, deliberate gesture. Grounding him. James let out a shaky breath, his fingers curling slightly, brushing against the dog's damp fur. His mind was still a battlefield, but Max was here, pulling him back, anchoring him. The panic didn't disappear. But for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel completely alone inside it. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, it was quiet. Just the sound of the wind, the distant rolling thunder, and the steady rhythm of Max's breathing. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. You still remember me, huh? His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. Max didn't answer, of course, but he didn't move away either. James looked down at him, something heavy pressing against his chest, but it wasn't panic this time. It was something else, something like hope. James barely slept after the storm. When the first light of dawn crept through the cabin window, he was still sitting on the floor, his back against the wooden wall, his fingers absently tangled in Max's fur. Sometime during the night, the dog had curled up beside him, his body a warm, steady presence against James' leg. He hadn't pushed Max away. And more importantly, Max hadn't left. It wasn't much, but it was something. James let out a slow breath and carefully shifted, expecting Max to pull away the moment he moved. But the dog only lifted his head slightly, his eyes groggy with sleep, before resting his chin back on his paws. James hesitated, then gave him a slow, cautious stroke down his back. For the first time, Max didn't flinch. It was a small victory, but James clung to it. The morning was crisp, the ground still damp from the night's rain. James stepped outside, stretching out the stiffness in his limbs, breathing in the cool air. The ranch looked almost peaceful now, like the storm had washed away more than just the dirt. He turned back toward the cabin just in time to see Max stepping onto the porch. The dog paused at the doorway, watching James with careful, unreadable eyes. James met his gaze. There was still distance between them, but something had shifted. Something had changed. I was thinking of making some coffee, James said, as if speaking to an old friend. Not sure if you still wait for me to drop something on the floor, but he half smiled. If you stick around, you might get lucky. Max didn't wag his tail, but he didn't walk away either. Another small victory. Later that morning, James found himself back at the fence where Max had once waited for him. Jenny was there, tossing hay into the troughs for the horses, but she glanced up when she saw him approaching. You look like hell, she noted. James huffed a dry laugh. Yeah, well, storms and I don't get along. Jenny wiped her hands on her jeans and studied him. He stayed with you last night, didn't he? James glanced back toward the cabin, where Max was now lying on the porch, his head resting on his paws. Yeah, he admitted. He did. Jenny smiled, her eyes softening. That's a good sign. James rubbed the back of his neck. It's more than I expected. Jenny leaned against the fence, nodding toward the dog. He's stubborn, but he's not heartless. He's just making sure you're not going to leave again. James swallowed hard. I won't. Jenny studied him for a moment before nodding. Then he'll come around. James wasn't sure if she meant Max or himself. Maybe both. That evening, James sat on the porch steps, tossing the old tennis ball in his hands. Max lay a few feet away, watching him with mild curiosity. Not eager, not excited, but watching. James rolled the ball toward him. It stopped just inches from Max's paw. The dog eyed it for a moment, his ears flicking slightly. Then, finally, hesitantly, he reached forward and nudged it back. James felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain. Something else. Something lighter. He picked up the ball and rolled it again. And again, Max nudged it back. A game. A small, quiet, hesitant game. James blinked hard, swallowing the lump in his throat. Yeah, he murmured. I missed you too, buddy. For the first time, Max's tail gave a single, slow wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of paws on the wooden porch. For days, Max had kept his distance, watching from the shadows, never fully retreating, but never quite closing the gap either. But this morning, when James stepped outside with a cup of coffee, Max was already there. Sitting, waiting, not at his feet. Not yet, but closer. James didn't acknowledge it right away. He didn't want to spook him. Instead, he sank onto the porch steps, stretching out his legs, letting the crisp morning air settle over him. He took a slow sip of coffee, feeling Max's eyes on him. Guess you figured out I'm not leaving this time, huh? He murmured. Max didn't react, but he didn't leave either. That was progress. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the tennis ball, rolling it absently between his fingers. He turned it over, the faded red fuzz worn thin from years of play. You used to chase this thing like your life depended on it, he said, more to himself than to Max. Drove me crazy. You know that? Always dropping it in my lap, whining until I threw it. Max's ears twitched. James smiled faintly. You were relentless. He rolled the ball a few inches away. It stopped just before Max's paw. The dog glanced at it, then at James. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Max reached forward and nudged the ball back. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Yeah, he murmured. That's my boy. Max's tail gave a small wag. Jenny leaned against the fence, watching James and Max from a distance. She'd seen animals learn to trust before. Wounded strays, abandoned horses, creatures left behind by people who had given up on them. But this was different. This wasn't just a dog learning to trust again. This was two lost souls, trying to find their way back to each other. She saw it in the way James moved. Carefully, patiently, never forcing, never expecting too much. And she saw it in Max, in the way his body had started to relax when James was near. It was slow, but it was happening. That evening, James sat on the porch steps, idly rubbing Max's ears. The dog lay beside him, head resting on his knee, his weight solid and warm. James let out a slow breath, staring out at the open field, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold. I should have come back sooner, he said quietly. Max's ears flicked, but he didn't move. James swallowed. I thought. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I thought you'd be better off without me. That maybe I'd just mess you up more. Max let out a soft huff, pressing his nose against James' hand. James felt his throat tighten. But I was wrong, he murmured, running his fingers through Max's fur. You waited for me. I should have come back. Max shifted, then, to James' surprise, pressed his head against his chest. It was the first time, since he'd come home, that Max had done it willingly. James closed his eyes, resting his forehead against the dog's, breathing in the familiar scent of rain-damp fur and warm earth. I'm here now, he whispered. And this time, he meant it. The ranch was quieter than usual that afternoon. The air was thick with the lingering scent of damp earth, the sky stretching endlessly above, clear and bright after days of rain. James sat on the porch steps, elbows resting on his knees, the old tennis ball rolling between his fingers. Max lay beside him, his body pressed close, his breathing steady and slow. It had been a week since the storm. A week since Max had come back to him. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. James had learned not to push. Max still had moments of hesitation. Times when an unexpected movement would make him pull away, when something in his eyes would go distant, as if he was remembering the long months of waiting, of loneliness. James understood that feeling all too well. Healing wasn't instant. But Max was here now, and that was enough. James turned the tennis ball over in his palm. "You up for a game?" he asked. Max lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. He didn't move right away, didn't jump up with the same reckless enthusiasm he once had. But when James tossed the ball, Max didn't hesitate. He ran. James watched as the dog chased after it, the way his muscles moved, the way his tail wagged just slightly as he caught it between his jaws. For the first time since James had come home, Max looked happy. The dog trotted back, the ball in his mouth. He stopped just short of James, staring at him for a long moment, as if considering. Then, finally, Max closed the distance. He dropped the ball at James' feet. James felt something break open inside his chest. Not pain, not guilt, something else, something lighter. He picked up the ball, smiling as he turned it over in his hands. "You still got it, huh?" Max's tail wagged once. James swallowed hard. "I missed you, buddy." Max stepped forward, pressing his head against James' chest. James closed his eyes, his fingers threading through Max's fur. "I'm not leaving again," he murmured. "Not ever." And this time, Max believed him. The sun was setting over the ranch, casting golden light over the rolling fields. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and hay, the kind of smell that felt like home. James stood at the edge of the property, hands in his pockets, watching Max roam the field. The dog moved differently now. No more cautious steps. No more hesitation. He was free again. Jenny walked up beside James, arms crossed as she followed his gaze. "He looks happy." James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, he does." Jenny studied him for a moment. "And you?" James let out a slow breath. He had spent so long running, from his past, from his guilt, from the things he thought he couldn't fix. But standing here now, watching Max chase the last slivers of sunlight, he realized something. He didn't have to run anymore. "I think I'm getting there," he admitted. Jenny nodded like she already knew the answer. "Good." Max suddenly turned back toward them, his ears perking up, eyes bright. He hesitated for only a second before bounding toward James, kicking up dirt as he ran. James knelt down just as Max reached him, the dog pressing his nose into his chest, tail wagging. James laughed, ruffling the golden fur behind his ears. All right, I get it. You're stuck with me." Max licked his face in response. Jenny chuckled. "Guess that means he forgives you." James looked down at the dog who had waited for him, who had given him a second chance even when James didn't think he deserved one. He nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he does." The last rays of sunlight stretched over the horizon as James and Max turned back toward the house, walking side by side. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning.